And joining us now in Washington, D.C., Don Peck, features editor of The Atlantic magazine and author of Pinched, How the Great Recession Has Narrowed Our Futures and What We Can Do About It. Don, it's good of you to show up on TVO tonight. How you doing?
I'm just fine, thanks, Steve.
Glad to have you aboard. Let us start tonight by talking about the wealthy. Tell us how the wealthy have weathered this Great Recession compared to other socioeconomic groups.
Well, they've weathered it quite well, in fact. You know, usually we see inequality decline during recessions because the wealthy tend to lose a lot of income. They tend to lose a lot of capital income in particular. You know, that did happen in the first year of this recession, but inequality has actually continued to increase throughout the recession. The wealthy have generally been bouncing back quite effectively. Even in the first year of the recession, according to Pew, the wealthy lost about 12% of their wealth, I believe, as opposed to about 23% by the middle class, because so much of this recession was tied up in housing wealth. Incomes are rising rapidly today in Manhattan, in Silicon Valley. We've all heard about Goldman's bonuses over the past couple of years. So generally, you know, the wealthy, the high income have weathered this recession pretty well, and many of them in many cities are coming back. It's really the rest of society that's been struggling.
Well, let me do one follow-up on that. All those people who worked, for example, at Lehman Brothers 3 years ago, you know, had their Blackberries taken away from them. They thought their careers were over, that this was the worst thing imaginable. They've all bounced back?
Not all of them, no, and finance has been hard hit. At the same time, the unemployment rate in the finance sector has never been as high as the average unemployment rate in the U.S. So, you know, finance was better shielded than almost every other sector in the U.S., in fact. So I don't want to paint too simplistic a picture. You know, there are plenty of people, regardless of education, regardless of prior income, who've been hurt in this recession. It's been remarkably wide-ranging. That said, you know, when you look at the data, when you look at the places where elites live, they have tended to bounce back stronger. They tended not to lose as much wealth to begin with either.
And the middle class?
The middle class has been hurt, you know, particularly what I call the non-professional middle class. I mentioned what's happened to middle class wealth, but middle class jobs have been going away as well. You know, one thing that's really significant in this recession, and that I think will outlast this period of weakness, is how it's changing the structure of jobs in the U.S. The MIT economist David Autor has looked at the structure of job loss from 2007 through 2009. You know, what he found was overwhelmingly the jobs that have been lost in the U.S. on net were what he calls middle skill jobs. These are jobs in manufacturing and non-managerial office work. They're the types of jobs that have traditionally provided a middle class living to people with a high school diploma, but not a four-year college degree. That's about 60% of adults in America. And many of those jobs aren't going to come back. The recession has really accelerated a trend towards the hollowing of the middle class that already existed due to offshoring and due to the restructuring of work and the replacement of labor with technology. We've seen that accelerated and worsened in the recession. And I fear that a lot of the people who've fallen out of the middle class today, many of whom have been unable to find work for months or years at this point, will not be able to climb back into it easily.
Don, let's try to understand where this so-called Great Recession fits into recessions historically speaking, because there are elements that are supposed to be, I guess, common to all recessions that take place throughout the course of history. What are those things that all recessions have in common, and are we seeing them in this one?
Well, you know, I think many people today think of recessions as being brief and shallow and leaving very few permanent effects on society. And that's largely been true in recent recessions before this one. But, you know, when you look further back in history at longer weak periods, the 70s, the 1930s, the 1890s, you know, where people just weren't getting ahead, not just for a year or two, but for 5 or 10 years, for multiple years, you know, you tend to see in those periods a different sort of phenomenon. You tend to see significant worsening in the political environment. You tend to see a rise in class struggle, a mean-spiritedness that becomes worse and worse, really, with each passing year. And you tend to see permanent changes to society as well. Not that society never recovers, but some people who can't work or can't get good work for a period of some years do never recover. Their families sometimes never recover. And communities where unemployment becomes concentrated and chronic for many years will often tip into decline that is very, very difficult to reverse. We saw that in the 70s with inner cities in the U.S., for instance. And many of those places took a couple of decades to even begin to come back. So I worry that this period, which is really unlike recent recessions, could have much longer lasting and much deeper effects than many people believe right now.
But I suspect the conventional wisdom is that after recessions are over and exports pick up and economies come back, things, I don't want to say come back to normal, but they do return. Most of the jobs return. Are you saying that's not going to happen this time?
No. I mean, I think we face a very, very long recovery. Certainly, on current trends, it will take years to get back to 6 or 5% unemployment in the U.S. If we can get back there. I think jobs will return, but there'll be, many of them will be different jobs. They may not be the same middle-class jobs that we had before the recession, and some people will be excluded from the labor market. Temporary unemployment can become permanent after a time. The average duration of unemployment in the U.S. is over 9 months today, and people that have been out of work for a year or two, they acquire a sort of stigma, and many employers simply begin to ignore them. When they have job openings, they instead look to the recently unemployed. They try to poach currently employed workers. So I think for a whole group of people throughout the U.S., a large group of people, this recession may not really end even when growth returns, even as the unemployment rate begins to come down. Without specific help from the government, I think they may have real trouble finding work again.
Who are those people, Don?
Well, I mean, it's a wide variety of people throughout the U.S. Certainly men have been affected more than women in this recession. The recession was called the man-cession. 3/4 of all pink slips initially were delivered to men. Men are concentrated in fields like construction and manufacturing, which have been particularly hard hit. So there is a gender impact here that we're seeing quite clearly. That has particularly significant and, again, long-lasting effects because when men struggle economically, when they're economically insecure or can't find work, families dissolve. Women tend not to marry those men, but they do have children with them. We're seeing single parenthood at all-time highs right now in the U.S. on the latest available data. So the struggles of men, which are particularly severe, I think can have much wider social and family implications, which could really affect our culture, affect children and their upbringing for many years to come. Minorities have been particularly hard hit in this recession, and the less educated people without a high school degree, most of all, have been very hard hit. All of these people, I think, are struggling to find work again, and many are likely to continue to do so.
Let me share with you and with our viewers an excerpt from your book, Pinched, and then we'll come back and talk about that. The fortunes of different places, you write, are also diverging quickly. High-powered areas like New York, Silicon Valley, and Washington, D.C. are putting the recession behind them. Former oases for aspiring middle-class Americans, Phoenix, Tampa, Las Vegas, have been exposed as mirages. Nationwide, newer suburbs on the exurban fringe appear to be in irreversible decline, and the families living in them are stuck and struggling. As a result, middle-class mores and lifestyles are being transformed, and so are the futures of middle-class children. I want to get, again, a better understanding of why this is different this time, because it seems that since time immemorial, cities established industries, those industries attracted people, those industries in some cases failed, the people left, they moved somewhere else where there was industry. America, I don't have to tell you, is a very mobile society. People move to where the jobs are. Why should this time be any different?
Well, if you look at the pattern of living in the U.S. over the past 20 or 30 years, there's really been an unprecedented migration by education level and economic potential. The best educated people, the people with the highest income potential, have overwhelmingly concentrated in a relative handful of power cities and creative enclaves like New York, San Francisco, Boston, Washington, D.C., Austin, Texas, Raleigh, Durham. And as that has happened in many of these places, and as real estate prices have risen, that has in turn forced out many people with moderate education, say high school degrees, fewer savings, a lower potential, and many of those people moved en masse to Sunbelt cities like Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tampa. They saw great potential in these cities, not because wages were rising quickly in those cities, because they weren't, but because housing was cheap but rising quickly. And in fact, for the middle class in America, wages really haven't risen for a decade. So a lot of people looked at housing as a way to get ahead and move upward. So in the wake of the crash, what we see is cities that look very different as to educational attainment, as to underlying dynamism, as to industries available. Housing was an enormous part of the economy in cities like Vegas and Phoenix and Tampa and Orlando. And with that gone, there is just not the industry, not the dynamism to really sustain a good lifestyle for the populations of those cities. You said that U.S. society is very mobile, and historically that's been true, but the U.S. is less mobile today than at any point since we've been able to track data. Mobility rose slightly last year because foreclosures began to force people out of houses, but it's still historically low, in part because so many people are homeowners now in the U.S. and so many people are underwater and can't move. I spent a lot of time in Tampa for this book, and that's what I saw there. A lot of people who are frustrated, who feel like the middle class lives that they had are very much under siege, and who feel they can't move, that they're stuck largely because of their houses.
Okay, I just quoted from your book, and now I'm going to take a quote out of your article in the Atlantic Monthly, and we'll finish up on this one before we invite the others to join us. Here's what you said in the September edition. One of the great puzzles of the past 30 years has been the way that men, as a group, have responded to the declining market for blue-collar jobs. Opportunities have expanded for college graduates over that span, and for non-graduates, jobs have proliferated within the service sector at wages ranging from rock bottom to middling. Yet in the main, men have pursued neither higher education nor service jobs. The proportion of young men with a bachelor's degree today is about the same as it was in 1980. While men and women now mix more easily on different rungs of the career ladder, many industries and occupations have remained astonishingly segregated, with men continuing to seek work in a dwindling number of manual jobs and women crowding into non-manual occupations that, on average, confer more pay and prestige. And I guess the question is, why do you think men have failed to adapt to these longer-term changes that you say have been underway in the economy for 3 decades now?
It's a huge, huge puzzle. And, many men, of course, have adapted. Many men are doing very well today. Men, on average, make more money than women today. All that needs to be acknowledged. However, a meaningful minority of men have really struggled as we've moved away from an industrial blue-collar economy to one that's more office-based, one that requires more education, more creativity, more social skill. Men have been doing worse than women, boys doing worse than girls in school for some time now. And it really is a puzzle. If you look at men with a high school-only degree in their prime working years in 1967, I believe 97% were working. Today, that figure is 76%. So whether it's because they can't sit still as adolescents in school and start out behind and don't have manufacturing as a kind of steady career anymore, whether it's because work has become more social and some men more than women struggle because of that, whatever the reason, what men have been doing as a group over the years, over the decades, has been dropping out of the workforce, working less and less. That's a phenomenon that's not just true in the U.S., which is primarily what I've studied. It's true in most of the rich world. It's been more and more true as the world has moved from industry to a post-industrial economy. And as I said, that's worrying for its own sake, for what it means for the opportunities of many men. But I think it's even more worrying because of its implications on family, kind of at the lower end and increasingly into the middle of society, and for what that means for the future of children in those families.